State your last words.
Defense has posed a lot of questions to you, almost as many questions as there are state's exhibits. And when they pose those questions to you, they are asking you to speculate. At the beginning of this trial, both sides gave an opening statement. And Your Honor told you that the opening statement was to give each of us, state and defense, the opportunity to tell you what the evidence we believe will be presented at trial. And while it is not just okay to say things, but we as lawyers, what we say is not evidence, and you are not to consider it as such. What you are to consider came from the witness stand and from the 300+ exhibits that you have. Defense said that the state would come before you and say, use your common sense. Use your common sense. That we would repeatedly say that. And they said that common sense equals assumption. Well, in your packet, there is an instruction called weighing the evidence. And it's not just the state asking you to use your common sense. The instruction actually says you should use your common sense in deciding which is the best evidence and which evidence should not be relied upon in considering your verdict. So when I tell you to use your common sense, I am not asking you to assume. Now, when you look at each piece of the evidence that has been presented to you and determining what the intent of Christopher Vasata was, if you look at it individually, it may not rise to the level of intent. But I ask that you look at it collectively. Defense presented to you an opening that this was about a negotiation. And just before I got up, they told you this was about scaring them or intimidation. Ladies and gentlemen, this was about the intent to kill. Sean, Brandy, Kelly, and Charlie. See, the plan was supposed to be that they would go to the house, they would be dressed in black, no one would see them, they had on gloves, they would kill all 4 of them, and there would be no witnesses. But what happened here is Charlie was able to run for his life and get away. And in the midst of that, Christopher Vasata got shot. And we can all agree that that was not a part of the plan. But unbeknownst to Christopher Vasata, when he was encountered by now Detective Householder as to what happened, all he would say is, I was at my buddy's house. I was at my buddy's house. And then we have Detective Hirsch who tells you, well, he told me he was at Charlie Vorpagel's house and he was sitting around a fire pit. But you see, the plan goes bad because Charlie didn't die, like Sean and Brandy and Kelly. And you have to start from the very beginning of this. None of us were there, but what you have to rely on is the evidence that has been presented to you. And what do we know? We know that Christopher Vasata, we know that Luke Kasukos, and we know that Marcus Stewart associate with each other. And defense has been calling Luke Kasukos' name from the very beginning of this trial. And it does not matter if each of you think that Luke Kasukos is responsible. Because just because Luke Kasukos may be responsible does not relieve him of his culpability in these homicides. We have phone records that show that they know each other, they communicate with each other. And while we can't make out exactly what the vehicle is at Paseo's Way, it is rather ironic that we have his car there from the night before until the next morning. I want to talk about Charlie Vorpagel. Defense has told you no less than 500 times that Charlie Vorpagel sells drugs. Charlie Vorpagel told you that he sold drugs. I told you that he sold drugs. But that's not what this is about. He told you he had guns in the house, and it doesn't matter whether he had 5 or whether he had 500. It does not give Christopher Vasata and Marcus Stewart the right to go in the backyard of 1105 Mohawk and slaughter them. And he knew that when law enforcement got there and went into his house, what they were going to find. And I want you to remember what Officer Marinucci told you about how it was that Charlie Vorpagel presented to him when he saw him in the street. He told you he could barely stand. He was hysterical. You heard it from the neighbor. He could barely make out what he was saying. He was telling him his friends were shot. He was so traumatized, they took him to the hospital and he had a seizure. But yet in that small window, they want you to believe that Charlie Vorpagel just all of a sudden lied and said that Chris Vasata wasn't at his house. For what? Charlie knows that Chris Vasata knows what kind of business he's engaged in because they're engaged in the same business. In that moment, this isn't a time for Charlie Vorpagel to reflect. All he knew is he was told Chris Vasata was at your house and said he got shot. Wait a minute. Chris wasn't at my house. If Chris was at my house, Chris was one of the shooters. Chris Vasata was just at the house the day before when he parked in the front yard. And I'd also add that he was well aware that Charlie didn't have a car because he was there the day before and the only car in the driveway was Sean's car.
Objection to facts not known.
Overruled. Rely on your own recollection of the evidence.
There was nothing for Charlie to gain by saying that Chris Vasata wasn't at his house. And I will say that prior to Charlie being arrested, charged, and being sentenced, he told law enforcement what happened that night. And it is not far-fetched or unrealistic that when Charlie is told that Chris is saying he was at his house, that he started to play back in his mind things that happened. That's very natural. And yes, he said he saw someone that resembled or had the characteristics of Luke Kasuko's, but if you recall, he was not able to identify anyone. He just knew that Christopher Vasata was not at his house, and that is what got the ball rolling. You heard them talk about what was found at the crime scene. There were casings, there was a live round that was a .40 caliber, there was a Glock pistol that was found. And yes, if you take that scene by itself, it doesn't tell us much of anything. But in this case, you all are going to have to put the pieces together. So we have a scene where we have casings to a rifle, and we have casings to a .40 caliber. And we do have a Glock pistol .40 that is there. But what does that mean? We heard from Mr. Felix about his findings as it pertains to the firearms. And I would also add that there was no testimony that Christopher Vasata was shot with a rifle.
Overruled.
No testimony.
Objection.
Up. Come up.
Mr. Felix told you that guns are very, very specific. You can't take a bullet or a cartridge, we got the correct terminology, you can't take a cartridge from a rifle and put it in a revolver. You can't put it in a .40 caliber. So we know here that there was a live round found next to Sean Henry's body. And again, you look at that one scene, it doesn't really tell you that much, so to speak, other than there's 3 people that are dead and there were lots of bullets fired. But then when you add in Paseos Way, you have the defendant in the middle of the roadway with injuries. Of course, Detective Householder at the time, not knowing what had happened, what do we have there? We have shorts, and we have a .40 caliber magazine. That is the same brand, Perfecta, Smith & Wesson, that's found at the crime scene in his pocket. And you heard from CSI Bryant that when they photograph, yes, they photograph far away, they come up a little closer, and then they get right up on the item. But in the midst of that, they photograph a specific area. And we saw the defendant's vehicle photographed in that parallel spot in Paseos neighborhood where you saw in the video. And inside of that vehicle, there were also .40 caliber, Perfecta, Smith & Wesson cartridges found. Defense wants to blame everyone else for what happened that night at that house. But you cannot deny that there was intent. I want you to think about this. So Christopher Vasata goes to this house he goes there to kill, but he goes to this house to negotiate a truce of some sort, dressed in all black. He conceals his identity. He's in a black hoodie. He's got black gloves. It's dark outside. To negotiate a truce or to keep peace. And so you take Luke Kasuko's to 1105 Mohawk, where your friend you know has a lot of guns. But you're just going there to talk? And you heard from the next door neighbor, his window's open, he can hear when things are going on. There was no talking because they did not go there to talk. And if you're going there to negotiate a truce with Charlie and Sean and Luke Kasuko's, why are you taking Marcus Stewart? Charlie Vorpagel told you, I don't know that guy. Because they all went there for the purpose to kill. This was not a mediation. And if you look at all the items here that we know were a part of the crime, this is not a mediation starter kit. This is a murder starter kit right here. These are all the necessary tools you need when you are going to kill people. I asked each of you during jury selection about whether everyone, despite being involved in illegal activity, do they deserve the protection of the law? And you said yes. And I know that Charlie Vorpagel, like it's been said, probably don't like him. They have shown you multiple pictures of the amount of drugs that were found inside of his house. But Charlie Vorpagel did not shoot anyone that night. Charlie Vorpagel was not armed that night. And while Sean Henry was armed, you can tell from the photographs that he didn't even stand a chance to reach and grab that gun. And do you honestly think they would say, yeah, come on over, let's negotiate a truce, and Charlie Vorpagel, with the amount of guns he had, is just sitting around at the fire pit unarmed? That is unrealistic and unbelievable. This is not about the text messages in Charlie Vorpagel's phone and who he was doing business with, because he was also doing business with Christopher Vasata. He thought that Christopher Vasata was his friend and that he was fake friends with Luke Kasuko's. In fact, he told you that there was one point he tried to sell me a bike that I knew belonged to Luke, which is why I really didn't think they were that good of friends. And do you really think, when you use your common sense, that if Charlie Vorpagel and Sean knew or thought that Luke and Chris Vasata were thick as thieves, that he would have said to him, hey, where does your friend live? Because I want to send some people to kill him. Really? And what did they say Christopher Vasata said? There was never any discussion about a truce the night before when he came to ask about guns. He never said, hey, I'm gonna come over here tomorrow and we're gonna try to work this out. Because that was not the plan. That was never the plan. The plan was to get to them before they got to him. And he took the side with Luke Kasukos, and he made it happen. This is not just a series of unfortunate events. And Christopher Vasata had to lie to law enforcement because the plan didn't go as they planned. What we presented to you is not just a scenario or some theories. It is what the evidence tells you, what the evidence supports. And whether or not there was a third person there does not mean that Christopher Vasata did not have the intent to kill. Christopher Vasata, the defense has asked you to point the finger at multiple people. But I would submit to you that Kelly Doherty, Brandy El Sahi, Sean Henry, and even Charlie Vorpagel didn't drive Christopher Vasata to Paseos Way. They didn't put the ammunition in his car. They didn't put the ammunition in his pocket. They didn't put the ammunition in the magazines. They didn't put his DNA on the guns. They didn't put his BMW car keys in the pocket of that black hoodie. They didn't make him come into the backyard of 1105 Mohawk. And they certainly didn't put his finger on the trigger. And that is who we are here about today, Christopher Vasata. They want you to believe that Christopher Vasata, they said to you that Christopher Vasata was carried out of 1105 Mohawk by Marcus Stewart. If you recall, Charlie Vorpagel, unable to identify anyone, said that he saw someone being carried. And there's no evidence before you that it was Marcus Stewart carrying, but we know someone was being carried out. And all of a sudden, although Christopher Vasata says, I don't know, I was getting pulled and I don't know who put me in the car, and they dropped me off at Paseos Way. So all of a sudden, they want you to believe that someone was kind enough, after this shooting happened, to just Uber him back to Paseos Way and drop him off right where his car is parked at. That is unrealistic. And ask yourselves this: if you don't know who put you in the car, how do they know where you parked your car at? To the T. You see, they thought they had gotten away from law enforcement that they initially almost struck when deputies were driving in Jupiter, leaving a canceled call. These are things you have to think about when you're deliberating and you're considering the credibility and weighing the evidence that's been presented to you. On first-degree murder, the elements are essentially the same, with the exclusion of the transferred intent, and there is also the principal's instruction. And the principal instruction says that the state has to show the defendant had a conscious intent that the criminal act be done, and that he did some act or said some word which was intended to and which did incite, cause, encourage, assist, or advise the other person or persons to actually commit or attempt to commit the crime. Ask yourselves, how is it that Marcus Stewart knew how to get to this house? And what was the need to have firearms at this house if you're going to talk it out? What do you need a magazine with bullets in your pocket for that match the gun left at the house? If you lend credence to what he's saying, at the point that your friends show up with a rifle to talk, we got a problem. And that's how you know this wasn't just a talk. And under the principal's instruction, he really doesn't even have to be there. to be responsible for these murders, but he was. And he went to great lengths. Yeah, just parking in Paseo's neighborhood, that means nothing. But we know there's a route that you can get there. You don't want your car in front of your friend's house when you're about to go in the back and you're about to kill them. And defense talks about the times being off, but if you look at the videos from Paseo's neighborhood, you get a detailed, it's approximate, but you get an idea of the time frame. And we know that Detective Householder and Sanders were in that area approximately 10:40, 10:45. And we know that when the first 911 call came in, and there may have been a video of Kelly and Brandy being at the store, but that doesn't take away from when this crime actually happened. We know when he pulled up, we saw two figures walking west from his car to the FP&L access road. And when you look at the first-degree murder instruction, it too tells you that it talks about premeditation. And sometimes we think that, premeditation may apply to, oh, it's been in the making. But the law actually says there is no fixed period of time. And that moment of reflection can happen right before the killing. But we know here, when you look at all of the evidence collectively, when you look at this table right here of evidence, when they got out of that BMW on Paseo's Way and they walked to that FP&L access road, they knew what they were going to do. This wasn't something that just turned bad in the middle of a talk. They had the intention before they got there. And even if you find that they intended to kill, or he intended to kill someone other than Kelly or Brandy, he is still responsible for the intentional killing of them because he went there with the intent to kill. And the instructions tell you that. Fortunately for Charlie Vorpagel, he did not die, but there is still a count for attempted first-degree murder. And the state has to prove and has proven to you that Christopher Vasata did some act intended to cause the death of Charlie Vorpagel that went beyond just thinking or talking about it. And again, you know what the evidence is. You have the evidence. This essentially wasn't what Sean and Charlie had done. They said they wanted to. They said they wanted to get rid of this Luke guy. Well, Chris Vasata said he wanted clearly to get rid of these individuals, and he did so with the help of Marcus Stewart. That Christopher Vasata acted with a premeditated design to kill Charlie Vorpagel. Again, look to the evidence of his actions. The act would have resulted in the death of Charlie Vorpagel, except that someone prevented Christopher Vasata from killing Charles Vorpagel, or he failed to do so. Charlie Vorpagel was literally running for his life. He ran out of his shoes, and you can see in the pictures, the crime scene photos, the path that he was running, they were still shooting at him. You can see the defects in the fence. There's a bullet that was recovered from the AC unit. But for him getting away, he too would be dead. Whether you believe he actually touched a gun, despite him having the bullets in his pocket, in his car, DNA being on the rifle, and the bullets, .40 caliber matching the gun, even if you said, well, maybe he didn't touch the gun, when you have that same intent as the other individuals you are with, you are responsible for their deaths. You are responsible for weighing the evidence that's presented and determining the credibility. And I asked you in jury selection, what types of things do you look for when you are judging a person's credibility? And that is what each of you are tasked with doing from what you heard from the witness stand. And if you call into question the things that were said, you doubt the testimony, the physical evidence and the science doesn't lie. You may question what Christopher Vasata's actual motive was for the killings, but there is no doubt as to his intent. Whether you believe he was responsible for some or all of the deaths, because he was there with the same design and intent as Marcus Stewart, he is just as responsible. And even though those bullets didn't have Brandy or Kelly or Sean's name on them, Christopher Vasata's trigger finger did. We ask that you find the defendant guilty as charged of first-degree murder for Sean Henry, first-degree murder for Brandy El Salhi, first-degree murder for Kelly Doherty, guilty of attempted first-degree murder of Charlie Vorpagel, and guilty of grand theft of a motor vehicle.